When a federal judge blocked Trump's border order, the former president didn't retreat to Twitter. He escalated the conflict by publicly confronting Chief Justice John Roberts, initiating a bold and unprecedented showdown between the executive and judicial branches. With the news flashing headlines about contempt charges and judicial overreach, Trump, surrounded by aides like Carolyn Driscoll and Pam Bondi, framed the court's actions as an assault on democratic authority, declaring he would no longer let unelected judges override the will of the people. As Roberts issued a measured but firm rebuke, Trump countered not with a press release but with a formal invitation, challenging the Supreme Court to a live, televised, National Judicial Reform Summit to debate judicial power and transparency in the court's own chamber. The move stunned Washington, drew international media frenzy, and forced the justices to decide between silence or spectacle. With Roberts agreeing to attend alongside 3 colleagues, and Trump insisting the people deserve to see judges unmasked as fallible individuals rather than untouchable symbols, the stage was set for a historic, high-stakes confrontation with no precedent and no curtain to hide behind. Just 2 podiums, a nation watching, and the balance of power hanging in the air. As preparations finalized for the unprecedented judicial summit, reporters and protesters lined the Supreme Court steps while Secret Service completed final sweeps inside, ensuring every detail was ready for what would become a historic moment. At 10 p.m. the night before, Trump stood alone in the East Room of the White House, reading over notes he wrote himself. No speechwriters, no edits, just conviction. The next morning, at precisely 11 a.m., he entered the Supreme Court chamber, leather folder in hand, and faced Chief Justice Roberts and 3 justices in a room never before used for such a confrontation. Without teleprompters or scripted remarks, Trump delivered a bold indictment of the judiciary, accusing it of wielding unchecked power and silencing the will of the electorate through legal technicalities. Holding up Judge Boasberg's order and the Declaration of Independence, Trump challenged the idea of judicial neutrality, calling it surrender disguised as restraint, and declared that judicial review had morphed into judicial rule. Roberts responded with calm firmness, defending the court's constitutional role as a stabilizer, not a servant of political tides. But Trump countered with cutting lines aimed not just at the bench but at the nation, accusing the judiciary of becoming an unaccountable oligarchy. The chamber fell into a stunned, reverent silence as Trump invoked Jefferson and dropped Boasberg's injunction to the floor, a symbolic rejection of unchecked judicial power. As Elon Musk posted from the chamber, a courtroom just became a battlefield. Trump stood not for applause but for clarity, declaring that it was time the people reclaimed their voice from behind the robes. The moment didn't just challenge precedent, it redefined it. This wasn't the end. It was the beginning of the fight he believed had been building for decades. He saw every injunction, every courtroom stall, every legal sidestep not as resistance to policy, but resistance to the people themselves. And now, the lines had been drawn, not between parties but between those elected and those empowered without ever facing a ballot. As the Judicial Accountability Act moved through committee, state legislatures began introducing their own versions, some even more aggressive, calling for term limits on federal judges and public audits of judicial influence. The legal world bristled. Law schools issued statements, bar associations held emergency panels, editorial pages lit up with warnings of Democratic backsliding. But the people didn't see it that way. To them, for the first time, the court wasn't a black box. It was a map. Court light revealed rulings like constellations, dots on a screen, patterns emerging, bias no longer abstract but visible. The sacred had been decoded. And Trump? He wasn't marching in protest. He was building, strategizing, setting the next moves. In a closed-door meeting days later, Pam laid down new polling data. Support for judicial reform among independents had crossed 60%. Among working-class voters, even higher. Trump glanced at it, nodded once. Then we don't need to scream, he said. We just need to show them what silence covered. By month's end, governors from 7 states publicly endorsed the act. One called it a necessary rebalancing. Another called it a correction, decades overdue. The media war escalated, sure, but something had shifted underneath the noise. People were listening. Teachers, truckers, veterans, even some who had never voted before. They weren't quoting politicians anymore. They were quoting the speech, line by line, word for word. Outside the Supreme Court, the protests didn't
Stop.
They multiplied, not in chaos, but in clarity. Citizens showed up not with megaphones but with printed rulings, highlighting the ones that had blocked policies they voted for. Some carried signs with one phrase: power without accountability is not justice, it's theft. Justice Roberts still never responded publicly, but behind closed doors the court requested a rare internal review, an unprecedented move in modern history. Not because of pressure from politicians, but from the country itself. Trump's folder kept growing. Names, dates, notes. But what stayed pinned to the inside cover was that same quote he had read aloud. Bold, underlined, undeniable. And while the world debated legality, morality, history, he focused on one thing. Because in his mind, you don't defeat an institution by dismantling it. You defeat it by showing the people what it's become, and then letting them choose whether to leave it standing. This wasn't about a win. It was a warning. The storm had passed, but the sky was still clouded with uncertainty. As living rooms stayed quiet, dinner tables buzzed with questions, and radio hosts dissected every moment of the broadcast. Beneath the noise, something deeper was happening. People were thinking, not about politics or parties, but about who truly holds power. In Flagstaff, Arizona, 62-year-old Marlene Cross, long disengaged from voting, felt something awaken when she saw a president confront the highest court and say their silence had become power. For the first time in years, she felt seen. In Jackson, Mississippi, former Marine Corey Bell watched in silence before finally saying, "That's what I've been trying to explain for years," as the illusion of a politically neutral judiciary began to crack. In Yuma, a history teacher read Trump's closing words to her class. "We're going to dismantle it legally, constitutionally, but completely." And a student answered with clarity, "The rules can't protect you if they're only protecting themselves." The moment wasn't about one order or one judge, but about a government that had slowly stopped answering to the people and started answering only to itself, while citizens were taught to believe in courts as neutral, just, and balanced, until the day those robes began to look more like shields than symbols. When neutrality turns into an excuse for inaction, it stops being virtue and starts becoming complicity. Trump didn't yell, didn't curse, didn't even point fingers. He simply held up the founding document and asked the one question too many had been afraid to voice. Who really runs this country? And the unsettling truth was, no one could say for sure. Not Congress, not the president, not even the voters. Power had quietly shifted into a system so insulated, so shielded from scrutiny, that even being questioned felt like an attack. But it wasn't an attack, it was a reminder. A reminder that checks and balances aren't symbolic, they're essential. And when one branch becomes too untouchable, democracy stops functioning and starts imitating monarchy, just dressed in robes. Weeks later, a handwritten sign appeared outside the Supreme Court. It didn't endorse a candidate, it said, "We gave you trust, not immunity." And that message wasn't just for the justices, it was for every official who forgot that America runs not on titles or tradition, but on people. The summit may have ended, but the awakening had just begun, echoing one simple truth. If democracy is real, it lives in voices, loud, imperfect, but free. If you believe this country belongs to the people, speak louder than the silence.